Hi everybody, today we are going to go ahead and do tracing with recursion. So recursion is basically just when a method calls itself. So see how this method is called tricky and it's doing a method call to tricky, which is its own self. That's what recursion is. So the question is asking us, what is the result when tricky 8 is called? So what you do is you just plug in 8 for n, and we'll just go from there. So since 8 is n, if n is greater than or equal to 0, we print n, and then we do tricky n minus 2. So I like to do this thing, it's called the smiley face method. We'll just start with the call to tricky 8 and do exactly what it said. Since n is greater than or equal to 0, we print n, which is 8, and then we also do tricky n minus 2, which is 6. Now, we still have to call tricky 6 because we're not done yet. So what's the answer to tricky 6? Well, tricky 6 is just going to do the same thing. Since n is now 6 this time, we will just go ahead and say if n is greater than or equal to 0, since 6 is greater than or equal to 0, we will print n and then tricky n minus 2. So tricky 6 will do print n, which is 6, and then it will do tricky 6 minus 2 is 4. So we continue with this process, and so we still have to finish the call with tricky 4. So tricky 4, now n is 4. So since 4 is greater than or equal to 0, tricky 4 is now going to be, we print n, which is 4, and then we do tricky n minus 2, which is 2. So whenever there's a call to tricky, we have to evaluate that. So now that we're doing tricky 2, n is now 2, and since 2 is greater than or equal to 0, we print n and then tricky n minus 2. So we'll do print n, which is 2, and then tricky n minus 2, which is 0. We still have to finally evaluate that final call to tricky, or whatever call we're on. So do tricky 0. So now n is 0, and so n is greater than or equal to 0, still true. So we will now print n, which is 0, and then we do tricky n minus 2, which is negative 2. Now n is negative 2 because we have to call tricky n minus 2. So now that n is negative 2, says if n is greater than or equal to 0, it's not, so tricky n minus 2 is actually not going to produce any real output. So this is basically like nothing. So that's pretty much it and how to trace this. Now let's think about what's the order that the items are going to go in when they print it out. So remember, we start with tricky 8, and so think about what's the first number that we print. The first thing that we print is the number 8 because we do tricky 8 first, and it first prints 8. Then it calls tricky 6. Tricky 6 then prints 6 and calls tricky 4. Tricky 4 prints 4, then calls tricky 2. Tricky 2 prints 2, calls tricky 0. Tricky 0 prints 0 and calls tricky negative 2. And tricky negative 2 doesn't really have an output. So what I like to do is just draw a little smile, because the smile basically helps me figure out the direction in which things print. So we're going to go this way. And so, little smile from left to right. So the output is going to be 8, 6, 4, 2, 0. And that is our answer, right here. Let's go on to the next example. So now we need the result when truck 8 is called. So once again, truck is going to call itself, so we know it's recursion. And if n is greater than or equal to 0, we do truck n minus 2, and then we print n. So let's try this one together. We'll do truck 8. So the first thing is we plug in 8 for the parameter, which is n. Then if n is greater than or equal to 0, which it is, we do truck n minus 2. So this is going to yield truck 6. And then we do print n. N is actually still 8. We're not done because we still need to call the truck 6. So now replace the n with a 6. And so if n is greater than or equal to 0, since 6 is greater than or equal to 0, we do truck n minus 2. So this would be truck 6 minus 2 is 4. And then we print n, which is still 6. Now we still need to evaluate truck 4. So we go ahead and plug in 4 for n. And then since 4, which is n, is still greater than or equal to 0, we evaluate truck 4 by doing truck n minus 2. 4 minus 2 is 2. And then we print out n, which is 4. Once again, we'll go ahead and now we plug in 2 because this is our value for n. So go ahead and do that. So truck 2, we have to do now. Truck 2 is going to evaluate to truck n minus 2, which is, and 2 minus 2 is 0. And then we have to print n, which is 2. After we do that, we still need to evaluate truck 0. So go ahead and int n is 0. If n is greater than or equal to 0, since this is still true because n is equal to 0, we have to go ahead and continue. So truck n minus 2 is just truck negative 2. 0 minus 2 is negative 2. And then we have to print n, which is 0. Then, after we're done with that, we still have to evaluate truck negative 2. So we'll go ahead and plug in negative 2 for n. And since n is greater than or equal to 0, actually it's not, since this is false, truck negative 2 will not produce any output. So I'll go ahead and cross that off. And now let's try to figure out what's the order that the items print in first. What will print first? Do you think the 8 will print first, or do you think the 0 will print first? I think that 8 will actually print last, because as you can see, you do truck 6 first, which does truck 4, truck 2, and truck 0. So as you can see, 8 ends up printing last, then 6, then 4, then 0, and then 2, and then 0. So I, again, just to do my little, like to do my little smiley face method. So smiley face goes like this. Go in the direction of the smile and only print out the stuff that says print. So when we follow the smiley face, it goes 0, 2, 4, 6, and 8, which is going to be our output. And that is our answer. Whoops. That is our answer to this one. Let's go on to the next example. What is the result when RIC8 is called? So this one's a little different because it has a print statement, then an n minus 2, and then another print statement. This one's a little weird. So let's go ahead and evaluate this with the 8 first, with n equals 8. So we'll do Rick 8. So first we'll go ahead and since 8 is greater than or equal to 0, we'll go ahead and do print n, so print 8. Then we do Rick n minus 2, 8 minus 2 is 6. And then we print n, which is still 8. Next, we need to evaluate Rick 6. So we go ahead, just plug in 6 for n. Since 6 is greater than or equal to 0, we go ahead and enter the if statement. So once again, we will print n, which is 6, do Rick n minus 2, 6 minus 2 is 4, and then we print n, which is still 6. Next, we still have to evaluate Rick 4. So we'll go ahead and plug in 4 for n. And then, is n, which is 4, greater than or equal to 0? Yes, so we go ahead and print that out. So we print n, which is 4. We do Rick n minus 2, 4 minus 2 is 2. And then we print n, which is 4. We still need to evaluate Rick 2. So we'll go ahead, plug in 2 for n. And since 2 is greater than or equal to 0, we go ahead and we're going to do print n. So print 2. Rick n minus 2, 2 minus 2 is 0. We'll go ahead and print n, which is still 2. We still need to evaluate Rick 0, so we'll go ahead and just int n equals 0, evaluate this again. If n is greater than or equal to 0, since 0 is equal to 0, this is still true. So we'll go ahead and print n, which is 0. We'll do Rick n minus 2. 2 minus 2 is, 0 minus 2 is negative 2. And then we print n, which is 0. And finally, we need to evaluate Rick negative 2. So we'll just go ahead and plug in negative 2 for n. But as you can see, once again, negative 2 is not greater than or equal to 0, so this is actually false. So we don't enter the if statement, which means Rick negative 2 will actually not produce any output. Now that we've drawn this all out, let's try to think about what numbers print first and what numbers print last. Well, as you can see, it looks like this 8 is going to print first, because that's what happened first, followed by whatever Rick 6 does, and then finally it's going to print 8. However, Rick 6, in order to do that, we needed to print 6, do Rick 4, and then print 8. But you can kind of see the pattern. It's just 8's printed first, then we have to do Rick 6, and then 8 is printed last. So we know that 8 and 8 should go on the ends. Finally, after we do print 8, we have to do print 6. So print 6, Rick 4, print 6. So we know that print 6 is going to come second. This print 6 will come second to last. You can kind of see the pattern here, but once again, we can go ahead and draw our little smiley face, and it ends up working once again. So smiley face, just draw this from left to right, and then just follow the numbers 8, 6, 4, 2, 0, 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, and just follow the print statements, and that is our output. So I'll go ahead and type that 8, 6, 4, 2, 0, 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, and that is going to be our answer for this one. Let's go on to the next example. Okay, so for number 3, what is the result when truck 30 is called? For this example, I'll just explain this in the next video. Thank you.